Okay. My name is Zijian. I joined Cadence team on this in this February, and I have been working on the cluster migration for about 8 months. Today I will show you I will give you an overview of how the migration looks like through the Cadence replication. So let's start it. The first question come to us is why we need the migration. The most common reason for people doing the migration is storage migration. Say your company is doing some storage migration. Today, Uber is deprecating Cassandra in favor of sharded MySQL. That is what's driving this project. And you may also want to get some issues from the existing storage. For example, some database may require heavy operations, and some database may not be very scalable, and you want to change a different storage. Another reason for the cluster migration is the data center migration. Your company may be setting up a new data center and decommissioning an old one. And in that case, you need to set up a Cadence cluster in the new data center and migrate all your customers to the new Cadence cluster and then decommission the old Cadence cluster in the old data center. So now we can talk about how we are going to do the migration. I will walk you through an example to give you a high-level overview of the migration process through the Cadence replication. So here is in the right diagram, you can see that there are two clusters, cluster A and cluster B. And in the cluster, we assume that there is only one global domain, which is called sample domain in those two clusters. And the sample domain is active in cluster A and is passive in cluster B. And workflow is replicated from cluster A to cluster B. And there is also a customer service connected to the clusters running the decision task and the activity task. So the first step for us for the migration is to set up the new cluster. So here we have a new cluster, cluster C. It's running on top of MySQL. And once we set up the cluster, we are going to migrate a cluster workflows from cluster A to cluster C. We need to update the replication configuration of the sample domain so that it can be replicated to cluster C. So in the right diagram, you can see that the domain is active in cluster A, and it is passive in both cluster B and cluster C. At this step, we still cannot deprecate cluster A because sample domain is still active in cluster A, and it is making progress in cluster A. So the next step for us is to trigger a failover to fail over the sample domain to cluster C so that it can make progress in cluster C, and the workflows are replicated from cluster C to cluster A and cluster B. You may notice that there's some issue with in the right diagram. There's no customer worker connect to cluster C, so that the customer worker is still connected to cluster A. So there's no worker executing the task dispatched from cluster C. One option for this is to set up a new worker connected to cluster C directly, the same as the cluster A and cluster B. But in our case, we have a new option. We can enable the auto forwarding for the domain. Cadence is able to forward the domain request to the active cluster if the current cluster is not active. In this case, we see that customer is still sending requests to cluster A, but cluster A knows that it is passive, and it knows that cluster C is active in this case. So it will forward the request to cluster C. And you can run it during the migration. You can run your service in this state for a few days. And if something goes wrong, it's very easy to roll back the migration. You just fail over the sample domain back to cluster A. And if you decide to move forward, we can remove the sample domain from cluster A. So that's the next step. But before the final goal is to decommission the cluster A. So before that, we cannot rely let the customer worker to rely on auto forwarding. We need to first update the customer worker to connect to cluster C directly. And then we can update the replication config of the domain to let it not stop the replication to cluster A. So it will look like this. So at this point, the sample domain is active in cluster C, and it is only replicated to cluster B. And at this point, there's no domain in cluster A. So no workflow data in cluster A. So we can move to the next step. We can decommission the cluster A. So you see in the right graph, we have successfully replaced the cluster running out of Cassandra by a cluster running out of MySQL. And you can repeat the same process to replace the cluster B with another cluster. So next, I can share our roadmap about the migration. We have set up a new Cadence cluster on top of sharded MySQL at Uber, and the cluster was running with the release of 0.22. And we also have done the migration testing. We set up a Cadence cluster with 3 clusters, a cluster group with 3 clusters. We have been running Cadence at Uber for 2 years with only 2 clusters. We never run Cadence with 3 clusters. So this is something what we are testing. And we found a critical bug which only appeared with 3+ clusters cases. And it was fixed in 0.23 release. And the next we are going to do is we are going to migrate all production clusters at Uber to use the sharded MySQL. And after migration, we will still continue supporting and testing Cassandra and other NoSQL storage. If you are interested in any details of the migration, you can check our documentation. And very thanks to Long for the contribution.